Great. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm sorry we're starting 2 minutes late. I am excited to be here. And as always, I want to thank Dr. Abioye Ibrahim, who put this thing together, and we've been working with to present Stats Clinic to you all. I'm very happy that you guys have chosen to share this few hours with us. And we're going to jump right in. Today, we're going to be talking about cohort and case control studies. And before we jump into the meat of the matter, let's talk about the essence of the matter. So research is for science. Research is also for decision making. I come from the school of thought that says research is for decision making. And what makes this really important is when you talk about insights, you must talk about implications. It's insights and implications. And as we go through, I'm going to show you that insights are not enough. You must tell us the implications. I'm going to model this for you. I'm going to demonstrate how you can use insights and implications, not just for scientific research, but for your personal, interpersonal, community, organizational, and politics. And I said this last week: personal, interpersonal, community, organization, and politics. This is called the social ecological model. Whatever you do in research, you must be thinking about what are the implications for every strata of the social ecological model. Okay, that said, let's go right into this thing. Okay, so remember for those of you who joined the session last week, I showed you the 2x2 table. Probably you guys have seen it or you've not seen it before, and we're going to see it again. But we discussed the 2x2 table, and in doing that, we understood that what you have in research is you're comparing two groups, or you're comparing three groups. And when you're comparing three groups, one of them becomes the reference group, right? And you're comparing two groups against a reference group, and you're saying one of them is exposed and one of them is not exposed, and you're looking at outcomes. That's why it's a 2x2. It's exposed and not exposed, maybe on the row, and outcome and non-outcome on the column. So here we have a pictorial representation of how it is done in research. Remember that last week I said no one in the history of the world has ever presented scientific literature saying, look at my 2x2 table. Don't do it. It's a rookie move. However, you can see it in this pictorial graphic. You have exposed and non-exposed. Suppose we're talking about smoking and lung cancer, or suppose we're talking about smoking and lung cancer. The exposed group will be the smokers. The non-exposed group will be the non-smokers. And you would follow these people. Time will pass because you don't smoke a cigarette today and tomorrow get lung cancer. Time passes. So you follow these people into the future and you compare the outcome. So you can see here that 3 people here would have gotten lung cancer compared to 1 person getting lung cancer. And when you do this, you'll say, oh, wonderful insight. Okay, let's move to another level of insight. And so the next thing you would do is called a measure of effect, or a measure of association, which is what we did last week. And we would say 3 people here versus 1 person here, you would say smokers are 3 times more likely to get lung cancer than non-smokers. Or you might say, and that we say is called a ratio. When you divide, is a ratio. And because we're following over time, it's a rate ratio. Remember that when it has to do with time, it's a rate. But you can also do a difference. You can say the risk is 3 minus 1, which is a risk difference of 2 people. 2 people per 1,000 person years. The risk difference in developing lung cancer between smoking and non-smoking. If you are a smoker, you have an excess risk of 2 per 1,000 person years of developing, this thing is so sensitive, of developing lung cancer. Right. So that's the insight. You say you go to the governor of Freetown and say, wow, did you know that smokers are 3 times more likely to get lung cancer? And lung cancer is impacting our budget. And the governor will say, yes, yes, yes. And so what is the problem? The governor is asking you, what are the implications of this wonderful insight? Insight and implication. He says, so therefore, Mr. Governor, we should restrict the manufacture and the sales of cigarettes in our community so that we can reduce healthcare expenditure, which is climbing at an alarming rate. Public health is for decision making, research is for decision making, and for you to do that, you must think about insights and implications. Okay, with that, let's talk about cohort studies. So a cohort study, I really like the way this slide is. A cohort study is analogous to experiments. Yes, because you do something or you don't do anything and you observe people. It's like experiments. You put something in a petri dish and then you watch it as it grows and then you count and you compare. Okay, but what makes a cohort study different from an experimental study is that in a cohort study, you don't assign exposure. So if we're talking about smoking and lung cancer, it's unethical and some may say immoral if you go and you give some people cigarettes and you tell some other people not to smoke, and then you watch them over time for the development of lung cancer. Some people did that in the past. They are called Nazis, and the whole world is struggling to defeat Nazi ideology. Don't be a Nazi. So you don't assign exposure. A cohort study is an observational study. You observe, you don't experiment, you don't intervene, you observe. Now, here's another thing, and this is what I feel is really beautiful about cohort studies. We have another slide that I will show you. So and look at this second line. Cohort studies begin, so sensitive, with a group of people who are free of the disease. So another point to note, we've said you don't assign exposure, but at the same time, you have to make sure that everybody in your cohort study does not have the outcome. You cannot include someone with lung cancer into your cohort design if you are looking at whether smoking leads to lung cancer. Dr. Ibrahim, can you give me a random name from, let's talk to Theophilus. Theophilus, can you unmute yourself very briefly? I want to ask you a question, rapid fire. So if you don't answer in 3 seconds, someone say, how are my allergies? I got some drug that seems to be working, so expensive, but thanks for asking. Is Theophilus ready? Let's go.
Yes, I'm ready.
All right. So Mr. Dr. Chief Alhaji Theophilus, help us answer this question. From last week, when we refuse to include people in a cohort study who have lung cancer, what are we looking at? Are we talking about cumulative incidence? Are we talking about prevalence, or are we trying to look at the risk ratio?
For last week, we were looking at the risk ratio.
Right. So my question is, in this line where I say don't include in your cohort study, don't include people who have lung cancer. If you are looking at a cohort study, looking at how smoking leads to lung cancer, what concept are we trying to ensure? Cumulative incidence, prevalence, or rate ratio?
Still remain a risk ratio.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to say we are looking at cumulative incidence, because we say in cumulative incidence, it is the people at risk that go into your denominator. So if you're looking at a cohort study where you are trying to look at an outcome or an occurrence of lung cancer, you don't want to include people with lung cancer in the beginning of your study, because those people are not at risk. But I understand your point, because at the end of the time, we're going to calculate a rate ratio. So you're correct. I think the way I asked the question is wrong. The point I'm trying to make is you have to keep fidelity to what you are trying to do. You cannot include people with the outcome at the beginning of your study. So thank you, Chief Theophilos. So that's an example of a bad question. I'll try to make sure that my questions are good. Let's see. Okay, maybe this is me. Okay, so there's another point here that you need to understand, right? Cohort studies begin with a single group that is agnostic with respect to exposure. What does that mean? I'm very against the use of jargon when I talk, but let me explain this. So there's this book called, what's this guy's name? He has the Bible, Leon Gordis. So Leon Gordis was a physician who became a public health researcher, and he wrote one of the textbooks that is widely used in the US for epidemiology. And the way he explains cohort studies, right? You take, let's say we are looking at smoking and lung cancer. This is what he says you should do. You take a group of 10-year-olds. Let's imagine that there are no 10-year-olds who smoke, or let's say 7-year-olds. You take a group of 7-year-olds. You don't know if any of them is going to smoke, right? Because they are 7, and you start to follow them and follow them. By the time they turn 14, 15, 16, 17, that's where people start to pick up these habits. Then you begin to observe. And that is why we have this word here. It is agnostic to the respect of distribution of exposure. Agnostic with respect to exposure. So you don't know who belongs to one group or the other. And that is why the best way to do a cohort study is to start from the back, long before these people even have a risk for the exposure, and you follow them forward. Let me show you in this graphic. And we're going to come to the 2 types of exposures. And it's a little tricky, so follow me here. Or don't follow me. This is an excellent graphic. Follow the graphic. So there are 2 types of exposures. One is a prospective exposure. There are 2 types of cohort studies, not 2 types of exposures. One is a prospective cohort and one is a retrospective cohort. Okay, so let's talk about prospective cohort. Now, here's the cheat code. In prospective cohorts, you are in the present and you follow people into the future. Follow me here. You want to know whether smoking causes lung cancer. So you get, like I said, a group of 7-year-olds in 2022. You follow them till they are 17, 2032. By the time they are 17, you know which of them have started smoking, or maybe between 17 and 21. So there are some who smoke, some who don't smoke. Then you now follow them for another 40 years to see which of them gets cancer and non-lung cancer. You see, you are following them from the present into the future. This has problems because if you're following 7-year-olds, 10 years, then 40 years, you may have died before you start to see your results. So that's a problem with prospective cohorts. And when you have that issue, you want to do a retrospective cohort. Now, in a retrospective cohort, you are in look at this guy here. You are in the present. You go back to the past and you follow people into the future. But it's not into the future from today, but into the future from the past. So you're basically following people into the present. So suppose you wanted to see people who have lung cancer or whether smoking causes lung cancer. You don't want to follow 7-year-olds from today into 2070. That you're going to be dead by then. So what you do is you go to 1980. You look for people who were 17 in 1980 and those who started smoking versus those who were not smoking, and you follow them, maybe not from 1980, let's say 1970, That's 40 years. That's good enough. And between 1970, you follow those people, smokers versus non-smokers. You follow them to 2022. You see that you follow them, follow them into the future, but it's the future that comes into the present. You follow them into the future, which is the present 2022, and you start looking for mortality due to lung cancer. So in this case, you want to know whether people who used to make tires in the past have mesothelioma, died because of the exposure to the rubber from the tires. So you go to when Michelin opened a factory in Lagos in 1960. You look through their records. How many of them were on the assembly line, tire makers? How many of them were working in Michelin, but they were not they were not on the assembly line? So they are just clerical staff. So the tire makers is the exposed, and the clerical staff is not the exposed. And you follow them from 1964 when Michelin opened in Ilupeju, Lagos, and you follow them all the way to 2022. You look at how many of them have died of mesothelioma in the tire assembly plant versus how many of them have died in the clerical staff. And what do? You look, just like Theophilus said, you look at the measure of association, which is a rate ratio. So Theophilus was very correct. My question was very bad. The way he understood the question was very correct. You look at the rate ratio, and then you have your insight. And you don't just rush to Twitter and say, oh, did you know that people who worked in Lupeju have? No, you go to the Lagos State governor and you say, because tire manufacturers predisposes us to mesothelioma, we should either, you can't say ban. I know in Nigeria, everything is ban. You say we have to put in protection measures for people who work in rubber factories, not just tire, but everything that has to do with rubber. People have to wear PPE. They have to wear masks so that they don't get mesothelioma in the future. Okay, so questions to ponder. Now we are back to asking people questions. I see Olushola Agbana, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Get ready to answer a few questions. And Joshua, for asking me how my allergies are, get ready. And Mercy Wanjala, I really like that name. Amina and Tasiri, also get ready to answer questions. Let us start with Mercy Wanjala. So in what cases would you prefer a prospective cohort study to a retrospective cohort study? Mercy, you're up.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. So let's go to Amina. Mercy, feel free to come in anytime, but Amina, if you're there, tell me why you would prefer a prospective cohort study or why you would prefer a retrospective cohort study.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
For a prospective cohort study, okay. What would you prefer? Please, can you take the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, why will you prefer prospective to retrospective, or why would you prefer retrospective to prospective? And please feel free to raise your hands. I'm just calling names that I see. And Dr. Ibrahim, let me know if there's anyone raising their hands and wants to answer. Let's go, Amina.
Okay.
Feel free to pass it to somebody else. Pass it to Dr. Ibrahim if you want.
Okay, that would be very fantastic. But let me try.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, for prospective cohort studies, as you have said earlier, it looks like a very long thing. Like we have to keep on following, and as you have said, some people may even start the research, but eventually not live to finish it, and not see the final results.
Okay,
But
okay, don't tell us all the answers. Let's go to another person, because if you tell us all the answers, there'll be nothing to answer. But exactly. So let's move to Olushola. Olushola, tell us the reverse. Why would you prefer a retrospective? Because Amina is giving us the exact best answer. I'll tell you another best answer after this. Thank you so much, Amina.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Why would I prefer a retrospective study?
Yours.
I don't think I know of a reason. I don't know actually.
Oh, you could just say the opposite of what she said, right? You prefer retrospective because if people have died, you want a retrospective. And that's why I tried to stop Amina from. Oh, you can mute yourself now, Olushola. There's a lot of scratching in the background. And that's why I tried to stop Amina, because I didn't want her to answer the next question. But let's think about this, right? So Amina started saying something really important. So you, the researcher, may not have the time to follow people for 60 years. So it's better if you go into the past and follow them into the present, right? But another thing is this. Even the children that you start to follow when they are 7, some of them might leave the city, some of them might leave the country, some of them might even, unfortunately, some of them might die before they even get to the point where they start, where the exposure makes sense. And we're going to talk about that. Ibrahim has this wonderful slide of competing risks. So let's say that you start to follow children from 17. So 50 of them started smoking, 150 did not start to smoke. But by 25, of those 50 who start to smoke, some of them die in a road traffic accident. That's going to mess up the balance of your study. Okay, so, and this can happen as a result. And when this happens, you call it, and that's this third question here, loss to follow up, or which would result in missing data. So some people may die, some people will move, and you have loss to follow up. I see Abbas Musa. Abbas has a question. In cases of diseases with high fatality rate, retrospective should be more suitable. Abbas, can you unmute yourself and tell us why?
We have a few questions.
Okay.
But let's
pause.
take Abbas first, then we'll take those questions.
Okay, so should Abbas answer, or do you want to ask the question?
Let Abbas answer.
Okay, yes. Abbas,
Okay.
can you defend your point very quickly?
Yes, if the like in case of COVID, the time to follow up before you even follow up, the time you will take to follow the people up will result in much more fatality. Understanding the causes through retrospective research will lead to much more faster intervention.
I like that. I like that very much. Yeah. So okay. Now let me tell you something. I tell the students that I teach this course in school. Sometimes there are no right or wrong answers. There are only strong arguments. When Abbas said we want to use retrospective because it may be more suitable, I was like, maybe not. But his argument is very strong. In COVID, don't follow people and wait till they die. People have already died. You can use retrospective. That is a very strong argument, very, very strong argument. Now, someone else may say, but in a prospective study, you can collect more data. Because if we don't know why people are dying in COVID, right? Maybe we are not testing their level of, I don't know, Hep C, I'm just pulling something, or a genetic thing. So you don't have information on that. But in a prospective study, you say, okay, we hypothesize that this gene may be the reason. So you start to test them as people are going forward. But what he just said is so important. You need information so quickly. You don't want to follow people 6 months. Let's use back data. Okay, let's go to questions.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Ibrahim, hit me.
Abdullah Balarabi, I'm asking you to unmute.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, I would like to talk about why retrospective is more important in some major cases than prospective.
Let's go. Let's go.
Okay, like for retrospective, in cases where there is an outbreak, it will be more suitable and more easier for you to trace back to find out the cost of that cases than to wait and follow it prospectively.
Right. So that's the point Abbas made, and you're very correct. Yeah.
Earlier, you have already said it all. Like, when you are following the cases prospectively, there is going to be a mess up in your data taking, like the road traffic accident, or in the cases whereby the patients under your studies can contact other diseases that can complicate your case.
Exactly. So that is true, right? Now, remember that I said you want strong arguments. Is there a stronger argument than that? Maybe not. Remember that you cannot, you know, I think it's Yoruba people say that a train that has already gone, you cannot do like this. I don't know if you guys can see me and say, please be coming back. And this means that in retrospect, something that has happened retrospectively, you cannot go back and say, oh, do we have data? We want to check whether it's a gene, or we want to check whether these people, you know, but prospectively, you can balance and plan your data collection. In retrospective, you are limited to whichever data is available. Prospective, you can decide, we're going to ask 100 different questions going forward. So you are very correct, but always know that there are arguments and counter arguments, and that may be suitable for different times. Okay, I see something here, but we are in question session. I see someone here said that for rare diseases, you would prefer prospective. This is a case where an answer can be wrong, and maybe there's a better argument. Feel free, but no, you want retrospective for rare diseases. Why? Because rare diseases are so rare. In fact, you don't even want retrospective. You want a case control study, because rare diseases are rare. What's the definition of rare disease? I think in the US, a rare disease is defined as a disease that affects less than 100,000 people, or maybe 1,000 people. I don't remember. Dr. Abioye can correct me. So in a disease that affects less than 100,000 people, and there are 200 million people in Nigeria, 100,000 divided by 200 million, you take away 3 zeros, you're left with 2 zeros. That is 1 in what? Maybe 20,000. 1 in 20,000 people. You have to follow 20,000 people before you see one case of that disease. It's too much resources. It's too much time. So you want to do a retrospective. Okay, I'm going to turn it to Ibrahim, and let's try to answer the questions very rapidly. So Ibrahim, if you can ask on behalf of people, then I will answer. And if you think some people should ask their questions themselves, let's do that.
Okay, so there's one question in the comments that says, if I decide to follow up pregnant women to see who develop preeclampsia with respect to certain level of, let's say, protein K, is this a prospective cohort or cross-sectional?
Oh, let's call on Tokwe Amusa, who is a professor of epidemiology, to help us answer this question. Dr. Amusa, what do you think?
If I decide to follow up pregnant women to see who develop preeclampsia with respect to certain level. Okay, so because you are following them forward, this is a prospective cohort.
I agree with you. However, right, and my however is not a but you said if you are following them forward, right? Which is different from if you go and look at their case notes for all the pregnant women who came in 2005, and you follow them from the first day they registered for ANC till their delivery or 6 weeks postpartum, then that becomes a retrospective study. But if as they are coming, you are registering them, and as you are registering them, you are following them till 6 weeks postpartum over the next 9 months. So yes, Professor Amuso is very correct. Remember, there are no right or many times there are no right or wrong answers. Rather, they are solid argument. So your professor will say, go back and look at all the patients we saw in 2019 and follow them forward. And somebody will say, oh God, there was COVID in 2020. So we don't know the effect of COVID on these women. Let us start from today and follow them into the future. You see, it's not a right or wrong, it's a strong argument. Insight, implication. Insight, implication. Okay, let's move to the next question.
One more question. I think we can take one more question. So there's a question about biases. We'll come back to that in the class. But there's one question that asks is if there is a standard time duration that differentiates a prospective study from a cross-sectional study.
Oh, that's a really good question. That is a really, really good question. And the reason why I think it's a really good question is I'm involved in a study, right, which is happening now, but it's a retrospective study. And even though it's happening now into the future, right, we're saying that the only time we will look at our study results is in the future. We're going to only look at them. Let me see if I'm even correct, you see, because it's confusing. So you say that oh, I have to think about this. I have to think, and maybe we'll send out an email. But you are right. Sometimes there is, just like with all life, right? What's a living thing? What's a dead thing? Is it prion, living, or dead? You know, there's always that overlap from time to time. The simple answer is this. If you go into the past and you follow them into the future, it's a retrospective study. You follow them into the future that is the present, it's retrospective. If you follow them from the present into the future and you expect that the outcome will happen in the future, it is a prospective study. That's the simple answer. However, I know that there are some retrospective designs, right, that might be occurring in the present, and I have to recalibrate my mind, think through how we're conducting that study currently. It's a HIV study, and then I'll be able to tell you. But for this course, for now, let's just say if you are following them from the past into the present where the outcomes have already occurred, then it's retrospective. If the outcomes are going to occur in the future from now, then it is prospective. Okay, should we go on, or do you want to keep asking questions?
Yeah, I think let's go on.
Okay, let's go. Okay. Oh, questions. You guys are asking me hard questions. It's time to ask you hard questions. Can we launch the poll?
Okay. If there's anyone who doesn't know, preeclampsia is hypertension in pregnant. It's not completely, but just think about it as hypertension in pregnancy.
Okay. So it's up to you to start and close the polls, Dr. Ibrahim.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Okay, closing the poll now, sharing results.
Okay, so we see that, let me look at the answer because sometimes even me, I need to know the answer. So we see that 42% of people got this question correctly. I'm guessing that Theophilus also chose this answer because this is very similar to the question I asked. To examine whether preeclampsia increases stroke risk, you visit women who had babies at your center in 1980. So think about this. When you see epidemiological questions, epidemiological questions are not story questions. You know, there's history for the physicians and nurses and people in the healthcare. There's history And there's story. History is stuff that's relevant for your patients. Stories are just stuff that you know that you just hear to fill up space, time, and maybe to enjoy yourselves. So if someone tells you about a center in 1980, now in their 60s, keep that in mind. This is part of history. It's relevant information. But here's the question: what is an appropriate epidemiologic measure that accounts for follow-up time? Remember, when you talk about time, you're talking about a rate, you know, and so just by that alone, you can select this answer. 42% of people got it right. Let's move to the next question. How good are we with time, Ibrahim, so that I can ask the remaining 58% of people why they chose other answers? Do we have time for that, or should we move ahead?
1 second. I think we might have a little time for it.
Okay, so the poll has gone off. So can a volunteer, anyone raising their hands, someone tell me why you chose another answer apart from this? Okay, while you're thinking of volunteering, I see a question. Can we get a brief snapshot about cross-sectional design? So let me tell you my cheat mode for understanding cross-sectional design. If someone tells you that they administered a survey in which both the exposure and the outcome were asked, they asked about the exposure and the outcome in a survey. That is a cross-sectional study. So for example, you know, someone would administer a survey to 60-year-olds and say, do you smoke? Question 1. And by question 13, say, oh, has your doctor ever told you you have lung cancer? You know, that's a cross-sectional. It's a snapshot. Like you say in your question, it is a snapshot. You're not following anybody forward. You're not following anybody backward. It is a snapshot. It is in time, just like a photograph. Okay, let's move to the next question.
I think Joshua wants to answer.
Okay, Joshua, hit me. Let's go.
Quickly, and then we can move forward.
Yeah.
Actually, I selected incidence rate ratio, but I was torn between selecting prevalence because, again, I'm just thinking about under what scenario would prevalence have had to be a factor if you're thinking about follow-up time. Again, we're looking at, you know, the progression within the study period and when they actually had to, you know, make this examination.
Okay, that's a good observation. So so here's the thing: if you're talking about new cases, so remember I told you guys why it would be why A is the answer, because you follow them over time, and so time has to do with rate. So if you are doing by elimination, incidence rate ratio is the answer. For why incidence is the answer, not prevalence, it is new cases. Remember that we said at the beginning, which goes to the question I tried to open with, you don't include people with the outcome in your study. You follow them and see if they develop the outcome. And when a person develops an outcome, that person is a new case. They didn't have it before. It's a new case. For prevalence, you are looking at people who, if you're looking at prevalence over a period of time, you're looking at people who have had it before you started counting and people who develop it. New cases and old cases added together. But for incidence, you're only looking at new cases. So it is an incidence rate ratio because you are looking at incidence, new cases over time, and it's a rate because you're looking at time. Okay, so we remember we were talking about competing risk, and this will be one of the issues with cohort studies. So we've already talked about this, so I'm guessing we can skip, but I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds to read this in case you have any question about competing risk. I believe Abbas and somebody else talked about competing risk. Some people may die, or maybe it was me. I talked about a car accident. Yeah, okay. 30 seconds, let's go.
We also have one question while people are reading. Okay. Adela, you want to ask a question?
Adela, let's go.
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi, well done. Thanks for for taking us through this class. So I'm trying to look at it, that incident rate ratio and risk ratio. Where do we delineate that this is the difference?
That's a really good question, right?
Because you know that cohorts, when you are measure of association or so in cohorts is risk ratio, and we know you are following them over time. You are looking at no matter the time you are recruiting them into the study, you are also putting that into consideration. So how do we separate?
It's a good question. It's a good question, and I'm glad that I know the answer. Otherwise, I'll be like, oh my God, this is a good question. I don't know the answer. But here's the thing, right? Remember that when you're talking about rates, you're talking about time, and when you're talking about time, you're talking about person time. So, like you said, it's the time people contribute. So, if I contributed 2 years to the study, it's my contribution is 2 person years. So if you're going to say there are 50 events of stroke over a period of 20 person years, let's say there are 5 strokes over 20 person years, it's 5 over 20. But for a risk ratio, let's say there are 5 events of stroke among 10 people, right? Those 10 people contribute 20 person years, but it is 10 people. So you're going to say it is 5 divided by 10. That's a risk ratio, or that's a risk that you use to calculate a risk ratio. But when you divide it by person years, it becomes a rate ratio.
I think that when we talk about open and closed cohorts, this question might even become clearer why it's often better to account for the time using an incident rate ratio versus using a risk ratio. So it all depends, but you will see it in a moment. I think
Okay, so have you guys read this? Is there any question? Let's move on. Let's go.
We have one question.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Amina, sorry, I muted you again. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you for the lecture. Please, my question is, how do we differentiate between confounding and competing risk?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really, really good. Oh, I mean, you should be teaching this class next time. So let's write her name down just in case I'm too busy making lunch. And here's the answer to that, right? These things are not mutually exclusive. A competing risk may lead to confounding. A loss of follow-up could lead to confounding. Loss of follow-up could lead to, it's not that, oh, if there's confounding, there's no competing risk, right? A competing risk may lead to different problems of bias in your study. So right. So yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you for that. Okay, shall we? Oh, there you go, loss to follow up. Okay, so let's look at loss to follow up. And so, like we said, and this is a problem with prospective studies. People may say, I'm not doing again because the way you guys talked to me last time, I didn't like it, or these people might have left the country. So what can you do? Involuntarily, oh, this is a good one. You see, okay, so let's think about this. Suppose you are thinking about depression. You are following people who are depressed. You want them to come to your study. You want to see what their blood pressure looks like. What's going to happen is that the people who are really, really depressed, and clinically, people who are really, really depressed are unable to get out of bed in the morning. Those people will not show up for your study. And those are the people who may actually have that outcome you are looking for, whether it's hypertension, whether it's suicide rates. Those people will involuntarily not show up to your study. Another example of involuntary loss to follow-up, like this slide says, is there may be some breaches. You say, okay, you were supposed to receive drug A, but oh God, the pharmacy messed up and gave you drug B or C. We're going to drop you from the study, right? Or the patient starts to take drug B and starts to vomit excessively. You're like, okay, dude, you know what? We're not going to even switch you to drug A. Let's just stop, because anyway. So what do you do? Remember that it's insights and implications. Also, we know what happens to loss to follow up. So you make sure you clearly tell people this is what is going to happen. So in one HIV study, people would come in and they would take blood samples, right? As the study progressed, they found out that instead of blood samples to test for antibodies, you want to take samples from the anal mucosa. And you can see that some people will be like, nope, you're not sticking anything up my butt. And they'll be like, thank you, but no thanks. So you want to be clear with your informed consent. What are we going to be doing in this study? What is the expectation? You want to be clear so people don't drop off, right? You want to follow them up. They have really nice nurses. Oh, how are you today? I just want to check and make sure that you filled your diary. Oh, if there's any problem, let me know. You know, in some cases, I was once involved in a study and I changed cities and they said, hey, we need you to come in for this study. We're going to pay for your train ticket. You see, that's how you minimize loss to follow-up. Some people say that if 30% of your data is missing at the end of your study, your results will be biased. I don't know who came up with this number, but it just makes sense. Also, if some of the people receiving drug A, only 5% of them are missing, but from people receiving drug B, like 40% of them are missing, you know, there's a problem. So let's ask Chief Maxwell, why do you think there may be imbalances in studies across comparator arms that result in loss to follow-up? Maxwell, if you will, Maxwell or Francis Motiri, please feel free to unmute yourselves and answer the question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Go ahead, Maxwell. I think it's already started.
Okay, yeah. So essentially, it's for me, what I feel about that is because people may have one reason or the other to continue to be in a particular study. And so just like you pointed out, the issue of movement and location, and then if there is also the issue of somebody complained of a particular side effect and then felt, oh, I'm not really comfortable with all of this, and then I'm like, okay, I need to just stop doing this with you guys.
Right.
Or again, and maybe in the event that, oh, the person just learns that this thing may not really be beneficial to me, and so I feel like I need to drop off this study. So loss to follow up is one thing that would always occur, even in the general public health intervention program that one is also implementing. So you would usually have HIV patients who are expected to come and pick up their drugs, but along the way, you find out people are dropping off, and then you, of course, you be concerned. Yeah.
Okay, good. I like some of the points that you made. Now, my question is, if you're giving two sets of people, drug A versus drug B, right? But you find out that the people in drug A, only 5% drop off. The people in drug B, 45. From what you've just said, you expect that people would drop off at random equally. The people who, especially if you randomize, the people who have trouble picking up their drugs in drug A will also, the same proportion will be affected in drug B. But you see 5% and 45%. And here's the answer. Sometimes, if drug A works and drug B is a placebo, meaning it does not work at all, after a while, people say, this drug people are not giving me. This drug people are giving me is not working in drug B. They will stop, they will drop off from your study, and they will go and find drugs that work. So you have to think about this as well. And what that means is, there's a lot of people with the outcome you are looking for that are dropping off from your study in Arm B. Okay, I see that I might have said something that I did not mean to say. Ebua meant bias and not confounded. I agree with Dr. Abioye. I'm not very sure, but I agree with him. I trust him. Okay. let's go. How are we doing with time? Should I step it up? Do we need to take a break?
I think we need to take a break soon, but you also need to step it up.
Okay, let's step it up. Okay, so I'll stop asking people questions and I'll talk faster. So you see in a closed cohort, this is going to make sense when we look at the open cohort. Everybody starts at the same time. For example, everybody who graduated in 2015 will follow you. Nobody else can join the study. And what's going to happen is you can have a lot of loss to follow up. The paper we discussed last week, Saturday, they had an open cohort. After they recruited people, they found out that their power was not good enough. So they included more people. Open cohorts. Loss to follow up can affect it. Also, your absence of an effect size can affect it. But look at this open cohort, right? So some people joined in January 2020. Some people were allowed to join in March. In fact, by 2011 March, other people were allowed to join. So this answers, oh, someone joined November 2011, right? This answers the question someone asked about risk ratio versus rate ratio. So if you do a risk ratio, if you do a risk ratio, there's a lot of problems, especially when you have an open cohort. You know, like these people didn't all join at the same time. Their risks are kind of time dependent, but you capture that with a rate ratio because you take into consideration the time that people joined the study and the time that people left the study. And of course, your loss to follow-up can be affected or can be minimized when you have an open cohort. Okay, so let's keep this because of time. And this is a good one. This is a really good slide. Remember what we said. You're looking at people who you cannot do a cumulative incidence, right? Because a cumulative incidence in an open cohort, you are trying to exclude people who are not at risk at the beginning of that study, but people are joining at random times. So it becomes messy. So a close cohort gives you the opportunity to calculate. So remember, they are no good or bad, right? Someone is asking what is censor in open cohort. I'll explain that. They are no good and they are no bad. But it is all about how much you can make a strong argument. Are you really interested in a cumulative incidence ratio? Let's go with a closed cohort. The question you are asking, you want to know of all the students who graduated in 2020, what is the failure rate in socioeconomic status? You can't use an open cohort. You have to use people who you have to start following people from when they graduated up till point. So someone is saying, what does censor mean? So if you're looking at death, for example, right? Some people might live up to 120. They may eventually die, but your study has to close next year. So you're going to censor those people. You don't know if they died after you close your study, right? So your study is basically censored at a time point. That's one a definition of censoring. So you can write censor, which is what I've just explained, or you can left censor. But let's not go into that. It's a discussion by itself. But I hope what I've explained. So someone says censor means to leave. Not necessarily. What I've just explained is for some reasons you're going to say we have to close this study today, but we are aware that the outcome may happen tomorrow. So there are methodological things that you can do to make sure that takes into consideration that it's really because we closed the study today that we didn't see this outcome. If we had expanded it for next 2 years, we may have seen some more outcomes based on the exposure. Okay, so now we're moving to biases. I think this is a good place to take a 5-minute break. What do you think?
I agree.
Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be here in 5 minutes. I will talk to you and I will see you guys soon.
But yeah, okay.
Okay, we are back. Okay. Let's see how we can power through. I see someone is offering croissants or croissants. Please send me some. And I'm wondering whether it's because what we're discussing is kind of technical. Is that the feedback? Is it a little tough to understand? Can someone give me one word, please, to describe how the session has been so far?
You can just type it in the chat, sir.
Yeah, type it in chat, one word. Someone said, great, thank you. Don't be nice. Tell me what you really think. And if you think it's great, I appreciate that feedback. Geeky, oh, thank you very much. Someone said croissants, engaging. Okay, tricky. I like tricky. Okay, so let's jump in. Keep going. Yes, a caramel latte. Yes, please. Dr. Ibrahim, can I continue reading this chat, because these people are talking about things that I really like.
You can come back to the chat, yes.
Oh my God, someone said caramel latte. I'm like, oh God, I need coffee. Anyway, let's go right now. Let's go. Okay, everyone, focus. Let's go. Okay, so let me tell you something about bias. I'll tell you two things. In fact, I'll tell you three. The first is this, right? No one is talking about fraud in science when you're talking about bias. Yes, we know people forge numbers. Those are bad people. Don't be a bad person, you know? But in our studies, we're not talking about the forging of data. When we're talking about bias, we're talking about, very simply, wrong answers. Wrong answers. When you do a study and you come up with a wrong answer. Let me give you an example. And this made me really, really angry. You know, 2020, there were a lot of people who came out on Nigerian Twitter, and they were modeling how many people were going to die in Nigeria. And they said, oh, so and so million people would die. They were very wrong. Their results were biased. And the reason their results were biased was because they did not take into consideration the transmissibility of the COVID virus and the number of people you need to move from one infection to 1 million infections and so million deaths. That is a bias. A bias just means your answer is wrong because of something in your study that is wrong. So for example, when we were talking about people who leave your study because they get the outcome and because maybe they feel your drug is not working, the outcome in that group that remains in the study will be lower and your rate ratio will be either exaggerated or underrepresented. That is a bias that leads to, or that is a bias because the results are wrong. That's the only meaning of bias you need to know. It is that your results come out wrong because something wrong has happened when you run your research. Okay. Oh, are we too engaging but not too fast? Okay, so we should try to be slow or we should try to be faster. Which of them? Dr. Ibrahim?
I think that the poster wants you to be slower. I think we also need to balance it with the need to cover the material. So it depends on, yeah, I leave that in your court.
Okay, thank you for passing the ball back to me. I will continue as is. And please, I'm sorry, but we want to cover this stuff. It's not easy. So we'll send the videos and feel free to reach out to us. We will be happy to respond. Okay, so someone came up, I think at Tufts University, which is where I went to, they're trying to count the number of biases that you can find in epidemiology. And they came up with 296. You can't remember 296. However, here's the great thing. All biases can be put into 4 or 5 categories. Selection bias, loss to follow-up bias, which Amina, who's going to be taking this class next time, pointed us to. Differential information bias and confounding. right? I might argue that information bias, whether differential or not, is just information bias. But remember again, sometimes there are no wrong answers. There are only strong arguments. And please, when you're discussing with your loved ones, maybe your wife or your husband, and they want you to do something, don't say, oh, there are no wrong answers. Please do what your wife says or your husband says. Don't say, oh, there are only strong arguments. That one, follow. Okay, let's go. So, but why, again, we come to insights and implications, right? When you find a bias, what do? These are the 4 steps. You need to be clear, first of all, if this bias is affecting your exposure or your outcome. So you need to know what your exposure and your outcome is. Then you need to name it. Is it confounding? Is it information? What type of information bias is it? And then you need to describe it. You have to say it is information bias because when so and so happened, it led to so and so, right? And then you have to say, how will it affect your study results? Because it's about insight and implication. So if someone publishes a study, you say, this study is biased. There is a lot of information bias. You're just a hater. If you say, this study is biased, there is information bias, and this is how it affects, and this is what happens to generate that information bias, and this is how it affects the results. You have moved from a hater who should be blocked on Twitter, no blocking, to a reasonable colleague or peer reviewer. Don't be a hater, be a peer reviewer. Okay. And feel free to tell your loved ones that. You see, I like your feedback. You need to tell me how. Give me examples. That's very strong. Okay, let's talk about selection bias. Selection bias is one of the most difficult things to understand. I was trying to read a paper 2 weeks ago by someone who teaches at Harvard. Ibrahim might know this person. I think it's Herman Miguel. Oh, it's a beautiful paper. It's so beautiful. It's just that I didn't understand anything I was reading. So I'm going to try. Now, this is what happens in selection bias. You, by mistake, remember that we're not talking about fraud. You select people who have both the outcome you're investigating and the outcome you are looking for into your study. So here's a beautiful example. You might tell somebody that, oh, I want to find out if people who are bald, and I'll tell you why we talk about baldness, get heart attacks earlier than people who are not bald. The idea behind that is people who are bald tend to produce a lot of androgens, and androgens may lead to hypercholesterolemia, atherosclerosis, which may predispose you to your heart attack. So it's really not, has nothing to do with the hair on your head, but what's going on in your body. But your friend is a nurse and says, oh, I can help you recruit people. And they go into the ward and they pick out bald people who are having or who have just suffered a heart attack. You see, they've selected the person with the exposure and the outcome, and they've put them into your study. So you, of course, you are going to see, and remember when you talk about a bias, you have to talk about how I described how it is a selection bias. Now let's talk about how it's going to affect your results. Because there you've selected a lot of people with both the outcome and the exposure into your study, you are going to see an overestimated rate ratio or odds ratio. You're going to see a lot. You're going to have an odds ratio move away from the null, which is the value of 1, to really high. You say, man, people who are bald are 16 times more likely to get heart attack than people who are not bald. It's really not true. It's bias result because your friend helped you recruit people who already have the outcome and the exposure into your study. So I talked about bias away from the null. That's how you talk about how your bias affects your result. It biases it towards the null or away from the null. So what is a null? A null is the value wherewith you can say the occurrence in the exposed group is equal to the occurrence in the unexposed group. So for instance, suppose the unexposed group has 20 naira. for the unexposed group to be equal to the exposed group, the other group must also have 20 naira. So when you divide, you get your ratio. That means your null value is 1. If you're doing a risk difference, when you subtract how much the exposed group from how much the unexposed group has, it will be 0. So your null value changes depending on the outcome measure you're looking at. If you're looking at an outcome measure that's a ratio, your null value is 1. If you're looking at an outcome measure or an effect measure where you're looking at a difference, a risk difference, your null value is 0. So you always should say, let us talk about how it affects our results. Don't just proclaim, don't declare, explain. Okay, let's move from, let's ask a question about selection bias, or is there any question that is anyone asking? So someone said, is non-probability sampling? Oh, this is a really good question. Oh my God. Do I know the answer to this one? Yeah, let's try. Okay, so Adiola, let me tell you about non-probability sampling. So right now, I believe there are 71 people in this study, but I believe that only about 30 or 20 people are discussing in the chats. So, and I'm telling you, and I did this on purpose. I said I was going to pick somebody at random. However, the only people I'm picking are the people who are in the chat. So you see that there is a difference in the probability that I will pick somebody who has not participated in the chat. It is different from the probability I will pick somebody who is participating in the chat. So you have non-probability, or maybe it's not a non-probability sampling, maybe it's a differential probability sampling. I am picking people into my study based on their participation, not a random selection from the whole group. And this is, your question is really, really important, because what you find out is that most studies, and when you do that, so instead of me to look at the entire list of people and pick randomly, I'm picking randomly from a group that's conveniently available to me. You're going to find out that a lot of studies are actually convenience sampling. And that does not necessarily, that may introduce bias, that's true. It may not, because it's so hard to really do random sampling. So for example, you hear about the nurses study, the paper we discussed the last time. These people wanted to understand people with high sexual behaviors, and they could not get the real people, which would have been sex workers. They opted for women who work in bars, and they made the assumption and projected upon those women that those women tend to exchange sex for money. However, by the time they published their results, we found out that only 25% of these women had had more than one sexual partner in the preceding 3 months. So it was their assumption about these women. Their sample was really a convenient sample. So it is not always that a non-probability sampling can lead to selection bias. It may, but they are not the same thing. Remember, the criteria for selection bias is if you end up including people with both the outcome and the exposure into a group. Remember that your cohort studies are agnostic to exposure and agnostic, and the outcome have not occurred because you are following people into the future. So some people would say, well, selection bias cannot happen in prospective cohort studies because the outcome has not occurred. That paper I was telling you guys about that I said I don't understand, I got some things from it, obviously, and one of them is there are ways that you can introduce selection bias into the study, but we are not going to discuss this. Just know that the major criterion. Okay, if there's no question, let's move, and let's move because of time, except Dr. Abiy feels that there's a question we really, really need to answer. So there are different types of information bias, right? There's recall bias. So let me tell you something about recall bias that's funny. Human beings are constantly looking for patterns. We're looking for, oh, here's the reason why this thing happened to me. I know of a woman, not that I know the woman, I know of her. When they found out she had breast cancer, She looked at her family and said, it's all that whipped cream that we always ate for dinner. Like, dude, really? No. How? And this woman was a physician. Like, whipped cream? No, come on. Human beings are always looking for patterns. So when you ask a person, a pregnant woman who has a child with cognitive impairments, like, Mama, do you remember ever having rashes while you were pregnant or a fever? They're going to say, it'd be like so, I think so. Compared to a woman whose child is healthy. And you say, oh, do you think you had a fever and rashes when you were pregnant? She say, no. I was totally healthy. That's recall bias. Certain people recall things differently from other people. Now, what that is going to do in your study is, if the women believe that this might be related to explain their condition, they are going to recall differently from those who don't have that condition. And you're going to have what you call a differential recall in your exposure group. Some people are going to remember just because they have a situation, an event, and whatnot. So that's recall. Interviewer bias. Interviewer bias happens sometimes when there are different interviewers, different interviewer styles, or sometimes when the interviewer is not blind. So let me give you a good example, right? Especially for those of us in medical field. If you did those short exams called OSCEs, so one person walks into the exam hall and they're asking him questions and he's struggling for his life and he goes, maybe he passes with a credit. Another person walks in, and as soon as he sits down, the consultant says, Bayo, how are you? How's your dad? And then he says, I went to med school with this guy's dad. Think about it. Will the other people ask Bayo tough questions? Not likely. They'll ask him simple questions and Bayo will leave there either with a credit or with a distinction. Is Bayo's result correct? No. Bayo has given us a result that is biased because there's interviewer bias. Another example in real research is if the interviewer is not blind to whether Bayo got drug A or drug B. For example, the interviewer knows that Bayo got surgery versus medical management, and the interviewer is a surgeon. He's going to say, patient, how is your pain? Your pain is 5. Are you sure it's not 3? It's 3, Joe. Let me write down 3. Okay, it's 3, right? Good job, 3. So the interviewer can bias your results, and you will think that people who do surgery have lower pain than people who go through medical management. Let's talk about missingness. Again, shout out to Amina, who talked about missingness, I believe, and loss to follow up. So we've talked about missingness, loss to follow up, and but here, let me explain missingness to you and why it can lead to information bias. If in today's culture in Nigeria and I believe West Africa and many parts of Africa, you give children in school, you say, take this letter to your parents, ask your parents to fill this and sign it. The children who give that letter to their mother will come back with the thing fully filled and fully signed. The ones who give it to their fathers, I'm sorry, Oyo is their case. It's really not going to happen. Apologies to the fathers. You guys are doing a great job. But it just shows, it's the culture currently that women who are caretakers kind of do a better job than the men, right? And this will lead to information bias in your study. It's not that there is, anyway, let's move on. You get the point, how missing data may be as a result of information bias. Let's do a poll and let's see how people are thinking about these. Over to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay. Launching poll.
This one looks tough. Do I even know the answer to this question? Ibrahim knows the answer. I'll just move to the next slide and see what the answer is.
All right, so I'm ending the poll, sharing results.
Wow. Okay, so let's look at the recall bias. So the question is, which of is unlikely, right? So again, I didn't read the question. You know, remember last week we said many times the reason why you missed the answer is you did not read the question. I was like, this question, I'm not clear. But you see, is the real question is which of them is unlikely? And only 37% of us got it. I want to bet that people did not get this answer because so let's look, let's close, or can we close this? And let's look at people here. Let's call somebody at random, okay? Random to Adiola. Adiola, let's call you at random. How about that? Can you unmute your mic and tell us why recall bias is the correct answer? And then someone else tell us really quickly why they chose another answer. And let's see what the problem is. Let's go.
Hi. The challenge is that I didn't even see the part. Which of the following question of bias is unlikely?
There you go. You didn't read the question.
It was not quite obvious. That last part was not quite visible on my screen. So I got discretion to pick that. Okay.
So let's have somebody else answer. I think Oluwabusayami wants to answer.
Okay, someone raised their hand. All right. Okay, let's do it. Oluwa, I like your name.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the reason recall bias is unlikely is because we are reviewing the clinical records. The patients are not being asked anything. So it's the clinical records that we are.
Excellent. So you can see that I told you guys last week, I believe, because I kind of tell every time I'm teaching, that epidemiology and public health research are not academic stuff. It's just stuff that you talk to your friends about. Anybody that's trying to make this stuff really academic is just trying to secure their job. You know, that's the truth, right? If you're looking at case notes, there's no one recalling anything for you. It's a case note. But this is the point that someone was trying to make earlier about retrospective or prospective, right? If you're looking retrospectively, which this is a retrospective study, there is no way you can get information, more information, as opposed to if you were doing it prospectively. Okay. So now I feel bad about what I just said about if someone's trying to make it academic, but you see, knowledge really is for the people, you know, and maybe that's a political statement, but come on, knowledge is for the people, and this stuff is for everybody. Let's move on. Okay, poll 15, let's do another poll. Let's go. Okay, so I'm reading that some people did not see the question. So make sure you read the question. Remember again that it is, a lot of people get the question wrong because they don't read the question. Don't read the history. Insight is the history. Implication is the question. Remember, insight and implication. Let's go.
Someone says, let's have the question here on the screen before moving to Zoom, because Zoom doesn't show the entire thing.
Oh, okay. Can you guys see it? Is this, are you seeing it now?
So I guess one thing I can do is that I can read out the question to you. So it says, you conducted...
Hold on 1 second, and let's see. How about this?
We're looking at your cost effectiveness paper.
Oh my God. Don't look at my cost effectiveness paper. Oh, God, no. Oh, this paper is torturing my soul, my very soul. And so thanks, Ibrahim. You've saved me from shame. Okay, let's see.
So we're not seeing anything on the screen right now.
That's because you saved me from showing people all my problems. How about now?
Okay.
What can you guys see?
Can someone just say what they're seeing in the chat?
Yeah, so Dr. Ibrahim, yeah, the question is on the screen, right?
Yeah, we can see the question, sir.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but just to say, I think there is also a way around this. Also, I just found out now that beside where, okay, so I'm using my phone. So where you have the three dots, so you could move between this screen and the poll screen, right?
Okay.
Yes. So that can be swapped as well. But this is perfect. So it allows us to read the questions. Then we can go to the poll and answer.
That's great.
Okay, so that means I should just leave it like this or what?
Yeah, just leave it like this.
Okay, cool.
One of the reasons we write these lengthy questions is because it allows you to think critically about many concepts in the same question, rather than a single concept.
Right. Agree. Okay. In the interest of time, let's give it a few more seconds and then let's go.
Yeah. Okay, closing the poll now.
Okay.
Sharing results.
So by the way, shout out to everybody who says, I don't know, because that is a correct answer. If you don't know, I mean, you don't know, right? That's it. So, but let's move forward. So we see that the answer is D, and again, less than 50% got this answer correct. So, does anyone want to volunteer why that chose D? By the way, oh my God, okay, maybe this is not the time, but is 35% statistically different from 20% or 25%, which is what you would choose if you chose D at random? But that's a philosophical question for next time. Someone volunteer and tell us why they chose D, and someone tell us why they did not choose D. Let me minimize this. Let's go real quick.
If you just raise your hand, I'll let you come up.
Okay, nobody. Let's go because of how much time. So let me so we
have
just
someone.
Okay, let's go.
Maxwell, you want?
Okay, yeah. So let me try.
Okay, try.
Okay, yeah. So this is about selection bias.
Okay.
Right. So, and then the question says you conducted a study to determine whether male baldness is associated or related to the age of the first heart attack. And then the caveat is that you note that testosterone use is associated with increased male baldness. So I select D. Enrolling only testosterone users will lead to selection bias because, of course, your interest is around studying male bias to see whether it has a link to the first incidence of heart attack. And persons who have...
so Maxwell, are you saying this is the correct answer or this is a wrong answer?
That's the correct answer for me.
It's the correct answer, but is it true that enrolling only testosterone users will lead to selection bias if you are unaware of the patient risk of heart attack at enrollment?
That's a yes for me because that's the option I selected actually.
Okay, so this question is tricky.
That's why I said it's tricky, but that's why I said let me give it a shot.
Okay, so because of time, let me explain this, right? So reason why this question is kind of advanced is remember that your selection bias, so you would be so if imagine that we enrolling only this question we might need to reword this question for next time. Enrolling only testosterone users will lead to selection bias if you were unaware of the patient's risk. So this question is not so great, and this is it. We already established that testosterone is or androgens is what could lead to your outcome, right? And so if you did enroll only testosterone users or a high proportion of testosterone, there will be selection bias in this study, whether you are aware of it or not. So let's move on from this question. I think we have the wording. The wording is not so great. Dr. Abiola, what do you think?
Yeah, can you take a quick moment to re-explain selection bias?
Right.
It sounds like that's something that people are really struggling with.
Okay, so in selection bias, right? Let me see. Let me take a deep breath in and do a good job. So in research, you want to be agnostic to the relationship between the outcome, the exposure, and the outcome. Your hypothesis may be that this person who has this exposure, smoking, leads to lung cancer. That's your hypothesis. That's what you think, but that's your personal problem. In research, what you must not do is go and confirm your study results by putting people who smoke and have gotten lung cancer into your study, whether by hook, whether by crook, whether because you know, whether because you don't know. You must make sure that you are not ending up putting people who have both the exposure and the outcome into the study. If you want to put people with the exposure into the study, put them into the study. But let's make sure that they are not entering the study in the exposure group because they have the outcome. And that's why we use that example of the nurse who goes into the ward and says, oh, we are doing a study to check whether people who are bald have heart attacks. And the nurse goes and looks through everybody who has a heart attack and looks at their head and says, okay, we're going to put this one, we're going to put this one. This one is not bald, we're not going to put him. What the nurse should do is look at everybody who has had a heart attack and without knowing whether they have a bald or not, put them into the research. Let the data show us instead of us to select, you see? So it's called selection bias. Instead of us to select who enters our study because of the probability that they have both the exposure and the outcome. I don't know if I've made it simple, but like I said, selection bias is really very tricky. In fact, it's so tricky that even our question, when we look at the answers to our question, we're like, oh, okay. Okay, so here's a slide where we're saying, oh, you can do some things to adjust for them if you find out that your nurse who was trying to help you has ended up messing up your study. There are some things you can do, but let's move on. Let's move into case control. We're going to rush through this because of time, and but let's do this. And I don't know why these two lions are here. Maybe because the beast to explain, but. Okay, so remember when we were talking about retrospective cohorts, right? So you go into the past and follow people like into the present, or you follow them into the future, but not into the real future. And somebody said, oh, you use prospective for rare cases. And we said, no, you don't use prospective for rare cases. You actually use retrospective for rare cases. And then I said, in fact, not just retrospective, case controls. So let's say there are only 50 people, 5,000 people in the whole of Nigeria with disease X. If you use prospective, you're going to be following so many people before you see one case, because there are 5,000 out of 200 million people. So what you do is you take a retrospective design, but also a case control design. You go and find those 5,000 people with the disease and you say, guys, come, stay here. Let's ask you questions about your past. And so that's why it's retrospective, because now you are going back to the past. Let us ask you questions about your past, about your family history, and let us see which of those things, the answers to your questions, can predict why you have this disease today. But for you to have a comparator group, you take a control group. So a control group will be people without that disease. And then you look back and ask them the same questions. And if there's a differential in the occurrence of having those risk factors you're asking in the case group versus the control group, you would say you would have evidence of an association between those risk factors and that case. So for example, when we saw a lot of mesothelioma in Nigeria and different parts of the world, people started asking these people with mesothelioma, where did you work? And all of them said, oh, I worked in a cement factory. Oh, we used to make asbestos. I didn't want to call the name of the company. I worked in a company where we used to make asbestos. And epidemiologists started to understand that exposure to asbestos in the past could have caused this high mesothelioma we're seeing. But for that evidence to be solid, they went to ask people who maybe they had cancer, but not mesothelioma. Maybe they had some kind of fracture or leg cancer or something. And they say, oh, did you guys used to work in an asbestos factory? And no, not really. No, not really. So that gives strength to the argument that people who work, and today we know that if you're exposed to asbestos, you're going to get, you're likely to get a mesothelioma in the future. And so again, insights and implications. In Nigeria, a lot of homes, including the one that I grew up, had this asbestos ceiling, right? So you have to think about it. What's the impact on our health? Now, some people will say, no, it's not the asbestos, the presence, is the shedding of the asbestos. But the question is, how do we know this asbestos is not shedding and we have just been breathing in asbestos all these years? So fingers crossed, man. Okay, so let's jump this one because there's too much math there. We don't want to do math. So in a cohort study, now, so some people are going to ask, so what's the difference between a retrospective and a case control? Here's the simple answer. In a case control, you go and gather all the cases or as many cases as you can. In a retrospective cohort study, you don't know what the outcome is because you close your eyes to the outcome and you go to the past when the exposure happened and you follow these people into the present. You do not know the outcome in a retrospective cohort, but in a case control, that is what you want to start with. You go and gather the people that are the cases and then you follow them back. Okay. So is there a question here? I can take one question, 1 minute, and then move on. Let's slay this beast. Is there a question?
No, not yet.
Okay, let's go. So it's either we all understand it or we all don't understand it. Let's move forward. So remember that we did, oh, there we go. Look at our friend here, the 2x2 table. So remember we did the odds. So I wasn't teaching you about the odds so that you can go and bet whether Ronaldo will score a hat-trick. It's because this is for public health. And if you want to use that, that's your problem, or that's your gain, or that's whatever you want to do. So in a case control, you cannot, and I will ask somebody a question. Let me ask somebody a question. In a case control, you cannot, Adeniji Lasisil Adewale, yes, you have been picked by random. Okay, so in a case control, you cannot do a risk ratio. You cannot do a risk, a rate ratio. You can only do an odds ratio. Why is that?
Because in a case, hello.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Because in a case control, like you said earlier, incident is something that has to do with time.
Incidence is something to do with new cases, right? New cases over time.
Yes, new cases.
All right.
With time.
Right. And in a case control, the cases have already occurred. So you cannot have new cases. Now, remember that we say, what's the difference between life and death? Is a prion alive, is a prion dead, right? There are cases where there are case controls where you recruit incident cases. And the reason why you recruit incident cases and not prevalent cases, and so you say, wait, come on, Eboa. Yeah, it's the same thing. But Just so that you know, right? There are only strong arguments. Don't tell your spouses that. That's nonsensical. But for research, there are strong arguments that you can make. When you recruit incident cases into your study, you are getting everybody. If you recruit only prevalent cases into your case study, you may be taking only the people who have survived. If you're taking only prevalent lung cancer, only prevalent breast cancer, you are taking people who have survived breast cancer. The people who get breast cancer and die within 3 months will not be able to enter your study. So sometimes you want to take incident cases, but at the same time, you are correct. It is the cases, so you cannot calculate an incident rate. Can you explain what matching is? Oh, matching, that's a great thing. So let's move forward. I'll explain matching. Let's do this poll. Let's do this poll quickly. All right. Should we do this poll, Ibrahim? It has something to do with biases.
Let's skip it. Yeah.
Okay, so let's skip it. Okay. The answer is information bias. Everybody take 30 seconds to read it and tell me if you would have got it. Okay, let's go. So now, so let's look at a real example for case controls. And the reason why we're looking at this example for case controls is because case controls are case controls is like making which food now? It's like, when you first make eforiro and then there's so much water in your eforiro, you're like, oh my God, that's what case control is when you're talking about cooking. When you use the wrong type of or you don't blanch it or something, feel free to tell me your recipes in the chat. So this is the case. Remember, you say you take a case and you must take a control. Now you have to make sure that the cases are really the cases. So let's say you're looking at whether leaving to a major bus stop is associated with hypertension. And you go and say, what are the cases of hypertension? And somebody goes around and says, do you have hypertension? And they say yes, and then you include them. Some people just say hypertension because everybody's mother says, don't give me hypertension. So you think your mother has hypertension, so you put them into the study. So those people don't have hypertension, you have misclassified them. You have to make sure your cases are your cases. What do? You measure this person with hypertension, you ask them to rest for 30 minutes, you cool them down, you measure again, and maybe you ask them to come back 2 weeks later and you do the measurements. If they pass, they have hypertension. That's the case. But there are controls. What is a control? Let me tell you a big study where they made a big gaffe with case controls. Remember, case controls are that study that people tend to mess up a lot. They were looking at men in South Africa, white men in South Africa who had a certain disease. And those men had the disease, and as their controls, they took their maids, the people who were pushing these men in a wheelchair, as the controls. Come on, and it was a published study. The controls must be equal to the cases. They must be from the same population. If a man has a full maid to be pushing him around, he and the maid are not the same level. They are not the same population. I'm sorry, that is a bad control. So your controls must come from the same population. And this is why, so we can talk about matching. If you pick 80-year-old men with Alzheimer's as your case, right? To ensure that your control is real, you want to pick 80-year-old men without Alzheimer's. You want to match them for maybe growing up in the same area or living in the same neighborhood because you want to remove environmental factors. You want to match them for these people who worked in a certain industry. For every person that worked in a cigarette company, you find a control that works in a cigarette company. For everybody who was not married, you find somebody who was not married. That is called matching. You match equal, or you can match along different variables to make sure that the validity of your results, we know that you don't want it to be confounded. You are matching a maid who is a low income earner and more likely female and young to an 80-year-old man who is wealthy and has a different life, Now, I'm going to skip this question. Ibrahim and I discussed whether we should have this, but there's no time. But if the study was on STI and the men are in wheelchairs, then their mates can be Okay, we're going to jump that one. Thank you very much, Francis. Selecting cases and controls. So we've already started talking about this. Now, there are 3 ways that you can look at controls. There are some people say take controls from the community, take controls from the hospitals, and you can take controls from the registry, right? And this is a simplified way of thinking about it. So if you are doing, and I'm very sorry, I've taken many examples about Nigeria, I use Nigerian language, and if there are people who are not Nigerian, I apologize, right? But let me say this. So if you're Nigerian and if you live in Lagos, you know about a Cohort hospital. What's the other one? St. Nicholas. If you take your examples, your cases from St. Nicholas, which is a high-end hospital, your control cannot now come and be Randall General Hospital. You know, you can't do that because the people who use a hospital are different in what they eat, in what they are exposed to, in their life stories. You know, it's kind of different. So they are really not considered the same population. So if you take people with gastric cancer in St. Nicholas Hospital, you want to take people with maybe fractures that can use a Cohort hospital or St. Nicholas Hospital at the same time, or people who come in for other things in the same place. So is it always that your control should be twice the cases? No, it can be 4 times, it can be 3 times. So you just add this number to give it robustness, to give your study robustness. So that's a use of hospital controls. There are many ways you can mess up a hospital control where it gives you problems, but we're not going to do that. Just have it at the back of your mind that why you are using a hospital control is because behaviors, the kind of doctors you see, the places you go makes you similar with case and controls than using other hospitals. There's community. If you take women in one local government, then you take the women in University of Lagos, you know. So these are women who have grown up in this local government in maybe Benwell, Bayelsa, or wherever. But the women in University of Lagos are students who come from everywhere else. The communities are not equal. So if you take people from using a hospital in one local government and you want to use a community, control, go into that same community and take people as your control. And the other is registry. So if you're looking at cancer cases in the registries, look for similar people who are in that same registry. I believe registries are the 3rd one, but please feel free to confirm this. There is a whole lot of discussion that goes into selecting cases and controls and what appropriate control should be. Keep in mind these 3 things: population, community, hospital controls. But at the back of your mind, always think about how a control may lead to biased results and how your cases may lead. Okay, there's this study, the same study about hypertension, baldness, and first heart attack. The control group, they allowed people who had angina to be in the control group versus the cases was people who had a stroke, you know, a heart attack, right? So of course, angina is a precursor to stroke. So those people who are in the control are not supposed to be there because they are part of they really are part of the heart attack group. Angina is a precursor or predisposes you to a heart attack. I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, but your control has to be case-free, you know. And so, and the discussion we had yesterday is that the case? If you're looking at the true measure of effect, you're looking purely scientifically, the measure of effect, your control group has to be entirely case-free so that you are only looking at what the effect of a risk factor is. How do you select which type? Remember that all research, I didn't say this, my mouths are closed, but all research is convenience sample. right? If you can't find these people in the community, go back to the hospital and take people from the hospital. If you have access to the community, take a community sample. If there's no registry, what do you want to do? But someone just typed it, so what you've typed can be used against you in the court of law. I didn't. Oh my goodness, this session is recorded. I didn't say it. That was not me. Anyway, so this I forgot that we have this in the slide right now, but when I was reading this slide yesterday, going over this slide yesterday, I was like, oh my God, this is good. This is a really good example. I want to give you 1 minute to read this slide, and then I'll start talking about it. We're rushing for time, and I apologize, but let's do this. One minute is up, Ebola time. Okay, so you're looking at patients. You want to look at the effect of fighting Boko Haram on PTSD in Nigerian soldiers. And so you take the cases, people who have fought Boko Haram, soldiers who are, and your controls, right? You now take soldiers. They are soldiers because they're in the same community, a community of soldiers. But you take soldiers, maybe you take soldiers who are working in clerically, they just work in the office. Is that a good control? Someone says yes, but another person says no. You want to know if it is the war on Boko Haram, right, that is causing PTSD. So you should think that maybe your controls should not be people who have not fought any war at all, but people who have fought in a war that is not the war against Boko Haram. And so you'll be able to say this war against Boko Haram is the reason why we're seeing PTSD. Maybe if they go and fight in Liberia, maybe because PTSD is complex, right? It is people, if you fight against your own, in a sense, you might have PTSD. But if you fight against something you feel is outside, you may not have PTSD. And that's maybe outside the scope of this, right? And so that is a case where your control might look good, but it is not so good. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay. Oh, so here you go. You have population, neighborhood. So I said registries. Where did I get that from? Maybe from something I read, right?
I think registry is correct too.
Okay.
Yeah, registry is correct, depending on what you have.
Okay, depending on what you have. So population, neighborhoods, clinics. Okay, so let's keep this, right? Just because of time. And again, I apologize. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. So here we're talking again about, now we have about 5 minutes, right? I can let you read the summary, but let us have discussions and ask questions. How about that?
That's great. If anybody has any questions, comments, thoughts, this is a good time. Raise your hand and I'll unmute you, let you. I have one question. Okay. Dr. Augustine.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. My questions are centered around the differentiation of confounding and confounding mismanagement. Sorry.
Matching?
Confounding mismatching. And another one we talked about.
Effect modification?
I didn't get the difference between them.
Okay, I think maybe it is
okay, confounding effect modifier.
Right. So we're going to do effect modification and confounding next. It's a lot. But I'm going to talk about confounding because we talked about it last week, and then someone's going to do a beautiful job effect modification next week. So in confounding is a type of bias because think about confounding as a hidden effect, right? And so, okay, I put something on Twitter, I think last week. Somebody did a study and said the amount of time you spend taking ARTs, maybe 10 years compared to less than 5 years, is a predictor of mental deterioration in patients. And I'm thinking, oh, there might be confounding here. The time you spend taking ARTs, 10 years, is indicative or associated with the time that you've been infected with HIV, which would be longer than 10 years. So the real reason why we're seeing mental deterioration, if it is true, this is just an example, by the way, if it is true, the real reason why we're seeing mental deterioration and a relationship between that and time on ART is really, the real relationship is the time this person has been infected and mental deterioration. So the time that the time for how long you've been infected with HIV is the real contributor to why we're seeing mental deterioration and not the time on ART. So time since HIV infection is confounding the relationship between time on ART and mental deterioration. So think of confounding as a hidden risk factor that is confounding the relationship between your exposure and your outcome. Okay, is there another question?
So somebody asks a question about, I was beginning to answer it, but maybe you can take it.
Okay.
And that is that, these days sometimes you see studies where people describe as comparative case control or comparative cross-sectional studies.
Oh, please take that one because I'm not sure. Let's go.
All right. So the thing with comparison, sometimes when people describe studies, the first thing you have to understand is that it's not every time people write that this is a comparative study design, whatever, or however people describe their study in papers, it's not always correct. So that's the first thing. Right. So you have to make your own decision by reading the paper and understand exactly what did they do. You don't rely just on how they have described it. So that's the first thing. So when you read the paper and then you make up your mind, oftentimes you realize that when they describe it as a comparative case control study, what they're really just describing is a case control study.
Right, right.
And sometimes when they describe it as a comparative cross-sectional study, what they're often describing, it's a harder design to wrap your head around in the sense that they have not selected the controls in a way that is deliberate. It's almost like they have a group of people of individuals, and they find out that these people have hypertension, these people do not, and then they just compare those who have hypertension to those who do not. So there isn't like the way that Ebua has described it, where you have identified the cases first and then selected the controls on the basis of the cases. So very often people are just splitting the population into two and comparing. It doesn't mean that it's completely wrong, right? But that's often just like a cross-sectional study, and we've talked about how cross-sectional studies, it's hard to make causal inference. You can't really say that the associations that you find, because you can't talk about temporality. We'll talk about temporality next week. You can't say whether the exposure came first before the outcome, right? Unlike in a case control study where we find the case and then we ask them about their history. We ask them about some of the exposures they might have had in the past and then use that exposure. So in a case control study, we are still sure that the exposure came before the outcome. But in these cross-sectional designs that people talk about, you're not always sure that the exposure came before the outcome, and that's an important distinction. I hope that helps a bit.
Right. Thank you, Ibrahim. Because when I see those things, I'm not sure